For many decades, Venezuelans had identified themselves as a tricolor people, the inhabitants of a nation where racism is almost entirely existent, a phenomenon some might say. Yet, many historians and intellectuals have argued that the reality is far away from this common truth. Venezuela is a country that experiences racism in significant levels, yet relatively hard to perceive when compared to the other manifestations of racism across the world. To unlock the mysteries behind the myth of the Venezuelan racial integration, one must sail on a travel to history. One must seek for a deeper perception of the formation of race in the South American nation. This racial formation starts with the migration of enslaved Africans during the colonial time. Dozens of millions of human beings were turned from their lands, stripped of their families, and relocated in a new land where they suffered physical humiliation, economic exploitation, social exclusion, and sexual violence. In Venezuela, the African slave trade lasted until 1797. Over 3 centuries, some 100,000 Africans entered the country by legal or illegal means. Once independence was established, those new rulers in power sought to retake effective control of the society and to reinvigorate the white sector of the population by uniting the opposite bands of royalists and patriots through the promotion of white immigration and the prohibition of black immigration. In analyzing the country's ills, Venezuelan leaders and their positivists ideologues point to the existence of population battered by the constant mixing of whites, Indians, and blacks. This is one of the motives that led to the 19th century ruler Antonio Guzman Blanco to promote large-scale European immigration for the improvement of the race, as he will argue. The situation persisted in the 20th century once the dictator Juan Vicente Gómez, one of the largest social planners in the history of the country who ruled for almost 30 years, came into power. Thus, the majority of intellectuals associated with his regime found the reign of Venezuela's troubles in mingling with blacks. It is in the midst of the civil formation of the Venezuelan nation that the concepts of African and Indian identity will begin to be lost. Racism endured in the social projects initiated by the dominant elites that replaced the colonizers. Though legal chains were broken, new incumbents were created. The appearance of the ideology of mestizaje, also known as the myth of democracy or racial equality, served to mask racial discrimination and the socioeconomic situation of Afro-Venezuelan and indigenous communities. With the aim of consolidating the processes of nation building, Latin American elites tried to forge a nation of mestizo identity that excluded Indian and Afro-Venezuelan ethnicity. The ideology of mestizaje denies the existence of social classes. In general terms, this ideology asserts that as the biological and cultural mix progress, society will move towards uniformity, thus eliminating the causes of racism. To achieve this objective, a homogeneous culture had to be created by the means of the educational system that will be capable of erasing heterogeneity, and thus of appealing to a single national traditional elevated over any other foreign or universal one. From the 1970s through mid-1980s, large economic expansion will increase immigration in the country, especially from mestizo, lower-class neighbor Latinos from countries all over the Caribbean and South America who were in the search for better living opportunities. That accounts with large increase in purchasing power parity across all the Venezuelan social classes that started the rise in the numbers of Afro-Latino class within Venezuela. Economic downturn in the late 1980s will revive racism and segregation in what is today known as its more common form, classism. Upper middle class and higher classes will blame races of Afro-Latino and Afro-Indigenous in delinquency and poverty in all the new undesired immigrants who were rapidly reproducing. In response to this visible increase in racism and discrimination, there was an increase in the number of organized social movements and Afro-Venezuelan and indigenous organizations pursuing more autonomous logics of social dynamism and less instrumental forms of political practice. As these organizations emerged, left intellectuals began to revalue traditional culture. The convergence of these various forces fueled a movement of cultural resistance and helped foreground issues of national identity. The main actors in this movement in the Afro-Venezuelan community have been the Union of Black Women and Afro-American Foundation, led by Jesus Garcia, which joined with other regional grassroots organizations to form the Network of Afro-Venezuelan Organizations in 2000. This movement will find empowerment behind the constitutional reforms that followed the election of Hugo Chavez during the late 1990s. Yet, the ground for full celebration of plurality of races seems to be far away. As pointed by activist Jesus Garcia, We're in an era of social transformations and globalizations, and the Afro-Venezuelan organizations have understood this process and have been active participants in the process of change. Today, if you talk to almost any Venezuelan, they will tell you that there's no racism in the country. Generally, it doesn't matter whether you speak to someone who's white, brown, or black. Actually, seemingly most Venezuelans, no matter what the color of their skin is, will probably say that they are and consider themselves to be brown or mestizo. The logical conclusion they draw from this is that since we are all racially the same, there cannot be any racism in Venezuela. The truth, as always, is much more complicated than just racism versus no racism. That is, while there is obvious racism in Venezuela, racism is indeed not the same in Venezuela as it is in the US or Europe. Cultural differences and racial or skin color differences overlap much less than they do in the US or in Europe. Venezuela's society does seem to be culturally more homogeneous than skin color differences. In contrast, in the US context, skin color differences overlap fairly closely with cultural differences. In this contrast, if you're white, chances are you'll have more in common culturally with other whites than you do with browns, Hispanics, blacks, or Asians. In Venezuela, however, this seems to be much less the case. Still, the lack of correspondence between skin color of race and culture in Venezuela does not mean that there is no prejudice or discrimination against people of a darker skin color, and that long is the path to follow until all social, economical, and racial barriers will be overcome.